into today's episode, I want to give you an update on the Lauren Agee investigation. Since we released those first 3 episodes, additional people with firsthand knowledge of the case have come forward. People who were there. People whose accounts have the potential to meaningfully change how we understand what happened at that lake. Because of that, we're slowing down. We're taking the time to carefully evaluate what we've received before moving forward. And I want to be clear, that's not a setback. That's exactly what responsible investigators are supposed to do. One of the core principles of Distilled has always been that an investigation should follow the evidence, not the other way around. When new information arrives that has the power to change our understanding of a case, we stop, we look, we make sure that we get it right. While that review continues, I'll be releasing both of my full interviews with Allison on Patreon for members, the original conversation from last year and our most recent follow-up. If you're not already a member, the link is in the show notes. In the meantime, we're turning our attention to a different case, one that asks a question that I've been thinking about for a long time, not just who committed a murder, but what happens when the people that we trust to answer that question stop asking it? What happens when investigators stop following the evidence and they start following a conclusion they've already reached? And what does it cost in years, in freedom, in lives when that happens? Today we begin the story of Susan Jean King and Kyle Breeden. It starts off in the fall of 1998 in a small Kentucky town with the disappearance of a 39-year-old man. But the story doesn't end there. It goes somewhere much darker, and it asks a question that I think matters far beyond just this one case. Can we trust an investigation to follow the evidence wherever it leads? Even when that's hard, even when that means stopping. Welcome back, listeners, to Distilled. Every case has a story. Distilled is what happens when we stop telling the story and we start examining the evidence. One question, one contradiction, one piece of evidence at a time, because sometimes the smallest details reveal the biggest truths. Before we begin, a quick orientation. The victim in this case is Kyle Dean Breeden, known to people in his life as Deanie. He was 39 years old. He lived in Shelbyville, Kentucky. His body was recovered from the Kentucky River on November 5th, 1998, and he had been murdered. The primary subject of this 3-part series is Susan Jean King, Kyle's girlfriend at the time of his disappearance. King was ultimately arrested and charged in connection with Kyle's murder, and we'll be digging into all of that in future episodes, because that is where the story ends. But today, we're going back to where it begins. To understand what happened to Kyle Breeden, you first have to understand where Kyle Breeden lived. Shelbyville, Kentucky sits along Interstate 64, roughly halfway between Louisville and Lexington, about 30 miles east of the city, out past the point where the suburbs give way to farmland. It's the county seat of Shelby County. In the 1990s, it was a town of maybe 10,000 people, with a main street of old brick storefronts and a surrounding county that was as rural as the town was modest. People knew each other in Shelbyville. That's not romanticizing the setting. It's just the reality of a small county seat in central Kentucky. You recognized faces at the gas station. You knew whose father ran what business. You heard things. By the late 1990s, the town was starting to change. A Walmart had arrived, some regional industry was moving in, but it still had the feel of a place where your reputation preceded you, where your family name still meant something, where people noticed when you were missing. That's important because one of the few things that we know for certain about the days after Kyle Breeden disappeared is that the people who loved him noticed quickly. Kyle Dean Breeden was born on March 2nd, 1958. He was the son of Wilford C. Breeden, who was a plumber, well known in the community, the kind of tradesman that people remember by first name. and of Mildred Jewel Breeden, known to most people as Millie. He grew up in the household in that small town, and in 1998, he was 39 years old and living in a trailer in Shelbyville. He stood 5 feet 8 inches tall. He weighed about 187 pounds. What the public record gives us about Kyle's daily life is very sparse. There's no long biography to draw from. What we have instead is the way other people talk about him in court documents and investigative files, in the way his name surfaces again and again through the story of what came next. So what we know is this: Kyle moved in circles where stability was hard to come by. He struggled with addiction, specifically crack cocaine. His autopsy would later confirm cocaine in his bloodstream, and accounts from people who knew him describe a man who was wrestling with the pull of that dependency in the way a lot of people in a lot of small towns wrestle with it. Not as a moral failure, as a fact of life that shaped everything around it. Money, relationships, the kind of choices you make when you need something badly enough. In the days before he disappeared, Kyle was facing a couple of specific financial pressures. He'd been telling his mother and others that a woman he'd been involved with, Susan, had taken $300 from him and was holding some of his property. He wanted it back. He'd been saying so to anyone who would listen. And on the last day anyone saw him, October 26, 1998, he went to a place called Kentucky Finance and took out a loan, $250, which he cashed that same afternoon. He was wearing blue jeans, white shoes, and a worn-out t-shirt. That is almost everything that we know about Kyle Breeden's day-to-day life, which is not very damn much. And I think it's worth pausing on that because in cases like this, cases that become investigations, that become court proceedings, that become the subject of appeals and wrongful conviction reviews, the victim tends to disappear. He becomes a timeline. He becomes a set of facts in a file. He becomes the reason other people's stories get told. What the record does give us in abundance is the relationship that would come to define how this case was investigated. And that means it gives us Susan. Susan Jean King had known Kyle Breeden for years, and their relationship was, the word that keeps appearing in every account is volatile. But that word can cover a lot of ground, and I think this relationship deserves a little more precision than that. They were on again, off again. Sometimes they were in a romantic relationship. Sometimes they were close friends. Sometimes they were something harder to name. People who tried to make it work, couldn't quite manage it, but couldn't quite let go either. The kind of bond that forms when two people have been through things together, even when those things weren't always good. There were protective orders. Both of them had taken out orders against the other at different points, which tells you that at times this relationship had crossed into territory that was frightening, that one or both of them felt unsafe enough to involve the courts. Kyle had violated a protective order that Susan held against him just the year before his death. And yet, in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, they were in regular phone contact, frequent calls. Kyle, by most accounts, was the one that was initiating most of them. The money dispute, the $300, the property, was a live grievance. But so was the connection. Both things were true at once. Susan was also close enough to Kyle's family that when he went missing, she was at his mother's home, sitting with Millie, praying together, hoping. On October 25th, 1998, the day before Kyle disappeared, he and Susan spoke on the phone. It was the last time that they'd talk. October 26, 98. Kyle Breeden goes to Kentucky Finance in Shelbyville. He takes out a loan, $250. He cashes the check the same afternoon. Then he's gone. That's the last contact his family has with him. Not a fight, not a goodbye, just gone. The kind of absence that in the first few hours probably doesn't register as alarming. Maybe he's out. Maybe he's staying somewhere. Maybe he'll call, except he doesn't call. October 27th, silence. October 28th, still nothing. For 3 days, Millie Breeden waited for the phone to ring. Kyle had his problems, the addiction, the money issues, the way life could sometimes pull him sideways, but this wasn't like him. Not 3 days of nothing, not silence this complete. On October 29th, Mildred Breeden went to the authorities and she filed a missing persons report. That's 3 days. It's not a week. It's not a month. 3 days, and she knew. That's important because it tells you something about Millie and something about the kind of family that Kyle had around him. Even if his life was complicated, even if he'd made choices that caused worry, he had a mother who paid attention, who knew the difference between her son being hard to reach and her son being gone. So now it's a missing persons case. Kyle Breeden, 39 years old, last seen October 26th in Shelbyville, Kentucky. And somewhere in the days that follow, Susan King is at the Breeden family home, sitting with Millie, praying together, waiting for news. During that time, Susan said something. She told Millie and she told others, friends, neighbors, whoever she talked to, that she'd had a revelation, a feeling during prayer or a vision, depending on which account you're reading. And the substance of it was this: Kyle would be found in water. In the moment, that's the language of grief and faith. It's the kind of thing people reach for when they're sitting in the unbearable middle of not knowing. When prayer is the only tool left and you're trying to find some kind of meaning in the silence. Susan said it to Millie. She said it to friends. She said it to neighbors. Kyle would be found in water. November 5th, 1998, 10 days after Kyle Breeden's last contact with his family, two fishermen are on the Kentucky River near a place called Gratz, a small community sitting on the Henry County side of the river, right at the point where Henry and Owen counties meet. It's rural country down there, the kind of place where the river bends slow and quiet, and you can go hours without seeing another person. They're fishing, and then they see something in the current that doesn't belong. It's a body. When investigators arrive at the scene, here's what they find. A man in blue jeans and white shoes, no shirt, it's gone. Lost somewhere between where he was killed and where the river carried him. His legs are bound together, ankles tied with a cord. The kind of cord that connects a guitar to an amplifier. He's been in the water for 10 days. The body is identified as Kyle Dean Breeden. The autopsy tells investigators a great deal. Kyle was shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber Magnum firearm. 2 entry wounds, no exit wounds. Both bullets are still inside his skull, lodged in the bone. The last part, the non-exiting rounds, matters more than it might sound like, and it's worth taking a moment to understand why. A bullet's behavior when it strikes a human skull depends on several factors: the caliber of the weapon, the distance from which it was fired, the angle, and the velocity of that round. In many shooting deaths, bullets pass through the skull and exit, sometimes leaving significant damage at the exit point. But in some cases, particularly with smaller calibers, like a .22, fired at certain distances or angles, or in this case, through a coat sleeve that may have affected velocity, the bullet enters and it stops. It doesn't exit. Non-exiting rounds matter in an investigation for a very specific reason. They can't have created bullet holes anywhere else. If the bullets never left Kyle's skull, then they could not have traveled to another location or lodged in a wall or in a floor. That's a fact, and we'll return to it. The autopsy also confirms the presence of cocaine in Kyle's bloodstream, and Susan King's revelation had been correct. Kyle Breeden was found in the water. From this moment forward, this is no longer a missing persons case. Kyle Dean Breeden, Deanie, was murdered. His body was transported to the Kentucky River and disposed of. Someone bound his legs, drove him to Grot's Bridge, and put him in the water. And nobody knows who. Kentucky State Police open a homicide investigation. Now, I want to spend some time on this because I think understanding how an investigation is supposed to work is essential to understanding everything that comes later in this series. When KSP opens a homicide investigation, they are not operating on instinct. They're following a methodology, a set of practices developed over decades of investigative work and refined through experience. And that methodology is built around a single fundamental principle. You don't prove a theory, you test one. That distinction sounds simple. It's not. It's actually one of the hardest things to do in investigative work because the human mind is wired to pattern match, to reach for narrative, to find the explanation that fits and holds on to it. Good investigators are trained to resist that impulse. Their job isn't to find evidence that confirms what they already suspect. Their job is to find evidence and then let the evidence tell them what happened. What does that look like in practice? On November 5th, 98, Kentucky State Police detectives have a body and almost nothing else. They know Kyle Breeden is dead. They know that he was shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber Magnum. They know his legs were bound with a guitar amplifier cord. They know he was transported to the Kentucky River and dumped near Grot's Bridge. They do not know where he was killed. They do not have a weapon. They do not have a vehicle. They do not have a witness who saw it happen. And they don't have a suspect. What they have is a starting point. The first thing investigators do in a case like this is establish a full picture of the victim's world. Who was Kyle Breeden? Who were the people around him? Who would have had reason, motive, or opportunity to hurt him? This isn't glamorous work. It's door knocking. It's sitting across kitchen tables from people who didn't necessarily want to be there, asking questions they might not necessarily want to answer. It's going to places Kyle spent time, the bars, the neighborhoods, the social circles, and asking who last saw him, when, what was his mood, was there any conflict, did anything seem off? Sergeant Duncan led the investigation. Working with him were Detective Fig and Detective Bess. Eventually, at least 6 KSP detectives would have their hands on this case. And by the time the initial investigation was complete, they had interviewed more than 40 people. 40 people. That is a significant number. That means canvassing Kyle's neighborhood, talking to people who knew him from the bars that he frequented, from the social world that he moved through, talking to family members who could speak to his habits and his state of mind in the days before he vanished, tracking down anyone who'd had contact with him in the days leading up to October 26th, trying to reconstruct hour by hour, if possible, what Kyle's last day looked like. And here's something important about that process. The investigators weren't just looking for a suspect. They were building a picture. Because the fuller and more accurate the picture, the better the chances that something in it, some detail, some conflict, some inconsistency would point toward the truth. That process of building a suspect pool is methodical. You start with the people closest to the victim, intimate partners, family members, close friends. Not because those people are assumed to be guilty, but because statistically, in the vast majority of homicides, the perpetrator is someone that the victim knew. Starting close and working outward is how you don't miss the obvious. You build the list. You investigate everyone on it, and then, and this is the part that gets lost in pulp culture depictions of detective work, you eliminate people one by one. You verify their alibis, check their stories, Look for physical evidence that either places them at the crime or rules them out. The goal is to narrow the field through the evidence, not to confirm a predetermined conclusion. By the end of the initial investigation, KSP had built a suspect list of 27 people. 27. And Susan King was one of them. But she was only one of 27, not the obvious answer that everyone settled on immediately, but one name on a list that investigators were methodically working through. That's important to keep in mind because the way cases get told after the fact often collapses all of that complexity. The story becomes investigators suspected Susan, full stop. But the reality is that for most of this initial investigation, there were 26 other people investigators were also looking at. 26 other sets of questions being asked. 26 other stories being checked. The fact that Susan rose to the top of that list is something that we need to talk about. But before we do, I want to finish the picture of what proper investigative work looks like because it's going to matter later. Before we move forward, I want to take a quick moment. Dark Dialogue has grown into more than just a single show. Everything that we do, from the full investigations to breakdowns and follow-ups, is all built to give these cases the time and the attention that they deserve. If you want to go deeper or support what we're building, the website is the central hub for everything. That's where you'll find bonus content, extended material, and ways to directly support the show. All of it is in one place so that you're not chasing links all across different platforms. All right, so let's get back to the case. While detectives are canvassing and interviewing, they're also looking for physical evidence. In a shooting death, that means looking for the weapon. What kind of .22 caliber Magnum firearm was used? Where is it now? Does it belong to someone in Kyle's world? And they're also looking for vehicles. Kyle's body was transported to Gratz Bridge. Someone drove him there. What car? Whose car? Any witnesses along that route? Any gas stations? Any neighbors who might have seen something unusual late at night? They're looking at the amplifier cord. Where did it come from? Is it a common type? Can it be traced to a specific brand, a specific store, a specific person? And they're looking at Kyle's last known movements. He went to Kentucky Finance on October 26th. He cashed a check. What happened after that? Where did he go? Who did he see? All of that running simultaneously across 6 detectives, across more than 40 interviews, across weeks and months of investigation. That's what a real homicide investigation looks like. Not a moment of inspiration, not a hunch that breaks the case. Methodical, exhausting, unglamorous work, and a commitment to following the evidence wherever it goes, even when it goes somewhere totally unexpected, even when it means stopping short. So let's talk about Susan. By the standards of a homicide investigation, by the methodical, evidence-driven standards we just talked about, Susan Jean King is not on that suspect list because of bad luck or bias or because someone decided to pin a murder on the nearest available person. She's on it because when you line up what investigators know about Kyle Breeden's world, in November of '98, she sits at the intersection of 4 things that any competent detective would be obligated to follow. The first is the relationship. Kyle and Susan had a documented, volatile history, mutual protective orders, an on-again, off-again dynamic that had, on various points, involved enough fear or conflict for both of them to involve the courts. Kyle had violated one of those orders the year before his death, and yet they remained in regular contact right up until the day before he disappeared. In almost any homicide investigation, the victim's intimate partner is among the first people investigators look at. That's not prejudiced. It's a reflection of decades of crime statistics. The majority of homicides are committed by people known to the victim, and intimate partner violence is one of the most common categories. Starting with Susan isn't a leap, it's just standard procedure. The second is that premonition. In the 10 days between Kyle's disappearance and the discovery of his body, Susan King told people, his mother, friends, neighbors, that she'd had a revelation that Kyle would be found in water. And then he was found in water. Now, at the moment Susan said that, investigators weren't present. By the time they learned about it, Kyle's body had already been pulled from the Kentucky River, and someone had to ask the obvious question. How did she know? Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was spiritual language that happened to land on the truth. Those are legitimate possibilities, and they don't require any sinister explanation. But the job of an investigator isn't to immediately accept the most innocent explanation. The job is to ask the question and find out. If someone appears to have had advanced knowledge of where a murdered man's body would be found, that is, by definition, an investigative lead that has to be followed. The third is the guitar amplifier cord. Kyle's legs were bound with a specific type of cord, the kind used to connect a guitar to an amplifier. During their canvassing, investigators learned that Susan King played guitar, that she had a guitar, an amplifier, and equipment in her home. That's a circumstantial connection. It's not proof of anything, but a victim found bound with a guitar amp cord plus a girlfriend who owns guitar amp equipment is exactly the kind of detail that you wrote down and you investigated. You find out if the cord can be traced. You find out if Susan's cord is accounted for. You don't dismiss it because it might be coincidence. You test it. And the fourth is the bullet holes. Kyle Breeden was killed with two .22 Magnum rounds. And during the investigation, detectives received information that there were bullet holes in the kitchen floor of Susan King's home. Now think about what investigators have at this moment. A victim killed with a .22 caliber firearm and a primary suspect with .22 caliber bullet holes in her floor. That's not nothing. That is a massive investigative red flag that has to be examined. Sergeant Duncan visited Susan's home. She voluntarily showed him the bullet holes. She had an explanation. She said she had fired a gun years earlier to scare off a man who had come to her home and made unwanted sexual advances. Kyle, she said, had since pawned that gun. Her explanation was plausible. It was not on its own exculpatory. The investigative question wasn't whether she could explain the bullet holes. It was whether those bullet holes were connected to Kyle's murder. And that required getting into the house, looking more closely, and potentially doing forensic analysis. So investigators sought a search warrant. Detective Figg and Bess interviewed Susan at her home on October 27th of 99, almost exactly a year after Kyle's disappearance. They spent several hours with her, asking about the guitar, the bullet holes, the relationship. They did not get her consent to search the property. A week later, Sergeant Duncan visited separately. He saw the bullet holes himself. He heard the explanation. And then he went to the local Commonwealth's attorney, the prosecutor, and laid out everything that KSP had. The relationship history, the premonition, the guitar, the bullet holes, 27 suspects, and the one that sits at the center of all four of these intersecting pieces of circumstantial evidence. He asked for authorization to search Susan King's home. The Commonwealth's attorney said no. There wasn't enough probable cause. So let me explain what that means and why it's not just a bureaucratic technicality. There are distinct legal thresholds that an investigation has to cross to move from suspicion to a search to charges to conviction. The lowest threshold is reasonable suspicion. Enough specific, articulable facts for a reasonable officer to believe a crime may be connected to this person. That's enough to focus your investigation, to conduct interviews, to take a hard look. KSP clearly had reasonable suspicion around Susan King. Nobody disputes that. But a search warrant requires probable cause, a meaningfully higher standard. It means having specific facts that would lead a reasonable person to believe that evidence of a crime will be found in a particular place. Not that there might be evidence, not that there could be, that there probably is. And probable cause requires something more than circumstantial overlap. It requires a factual basis that rises above coincidence and inference. What the Commonwealth's attorney saw when he looked at KSP's case was 4 pieces of circumstantial evidence: an ex-girlfriend with a volatile history, a spiritual statement about water made in the context of grief, a shared category of equipment, guitar gear, without any kind of specific link between Susan's cord and the cord on Kyle's body, and bullet holes that had a plausible, innocent explanation. What he didn't see was any physical evidence. No forensic connection between Kyle and Susan's home, no blood, no DNA, no ballistic match between her floor and the bullets in Kyle's skull, no weapon, no vehicle tied to the bridge. Without that, he concluded correctly that the circumstantial evidence didn't reach the level of probable cause for a search. And a judge agreed. And here is the part of this story that I think gets lost most often in the telling. What happened next is actually the investigation working exactly the way it's supposed to work. Sergeant Duncan looked at everything that he had. He looked at the 4 circumstantial elements. He looked at the failed warrant application. He looked at what the evidence could support and what it couldn't. And he recorded his conclusion in the official case file. He did not believe Susan Jean King was responsible for Kyle Breeden's death. That sentence is important. This is the lead detective on the case, the man who spent a year looking at Susan as the primary suspect, who interviewed her, who saw the bullet holes with his own eyes, who reviewed every piece of evidence the investigation had produced. And his conclusion, written in the official record, was that the evidence didn't support charging her. The system worked. The investigation had followed the evidence as far as the evidence would go. It had found a legitimate suspect and looked hard at her. And then, when the evidence ran out, it stopped, because that's what reasonable investigators are supposed to do. No charges were filed, no arrests were made. Kyle Breeden's murder remained unsolved. A cold case, but not a closed case. And that distinction matters more than it might seem. When an investigation goes cold, the file doesn't just disappear. It doesn't get destroyed or forgotten. It sits in a cabinet, in a record system, on a shelf, waiting. And the door is left open, at least in principle, for new evidence to arrive. A witness who finally decides to talk. A piece of forensic technology that didn't exist when the case was first worked. A confession, a deathbed admission, something. From late 1999 onward, Kyle Breeden's case went cold. The investigation had done its work, 40 plus interviews, 27 suspects evaluated, multiple search warrant attempts, weeks and months of methodical detective work. And at the end of it all, the lead investigator had decided that he couldn't support charging anyone, including the woman who sat at the center of his 4 strongest circumstantial leads. So the file went quiet. Millie Breeden waited. Kyle's family waited. 1 year passed, then 2, then 5, and then 7. No new witnesses came forward with information that changed the picture. No new physical evidence surfaced. No weapon was recovered. No one came to the authorities with a story that broke the case open. Nothing changed. The evidence was exactly what it had been in 1999 when Sergeant Duncan looked at it and wrote his conclusion in that file. The 4 circumstantial elements around Susan King, the absence of anything physical, the warrant that had been denied, the dead end at the edge of what the evidence could support. Nothing changed, except this. On May 22nd, 2006, a Kentucky State Police detective named Tom Harwood received the case file. The same photographs, the same interview notes from 1998 and 1999, the same 4 circumstantial evidence that the original investigators had looked at and decided after a year of serious methodical work weren't enough. Harwood opened the file, and 21 days later, he was convinced that he'd solved it. 7 years, no new evidence, no new witnesses, no new technology, no confession, no weapon, nothing the original team didn't already have. One detective, 21 days, a certainty the original investigators never found. Next time, we're going to ask a simple question. How does a detective look at exactly the same evidence as his predecessors? Evidence that experienced investigators spent a year evaluating and decided wasn't enough, and arrive at an entirely different conclusion. What does it look like when an investigation stops following the evidence? And what does it cost? Throughout this episode, we've spent a lot of time with Kyle Breeden as a case, as a timeline, as the center of an investigation that would go on without him, in directions he never could have anticipated. But Kyle Breeden was a man. He was Millie's son. He was Wilford's son. He was 39 years old, living in Shelbyville, Kentucky, moving through a life that had its complications and its mess and its moments of grace like most lives do. He had people who noticed when he went silent, people who went looking, people who sat in a living room and prayed for him to come home. His murder went unsolved for years, and the truth, when it finally came, as it eventually did, came with a cost that we'll spend 2 more episodes reckoning with. But before we get there, we want to step away from the investigation for just a moment, because before there were reports and warrants and files, there was a man whose life was taken, and a family whose grief didn't end when the case went cold. It continued through every year that the file sat on a shelf. It continued through the trial and the conviction and the appeals and everything that came later. It's still continuing. Kyle Dean Breeden deserves to be remembered as more than the reason a case exists. This is Darkest Day by the J.J. Hawk Band. And this is Kyle Breeden. Kyle Dean Breeden was born on March 2nd, 1958 in Shelbyville, Kentucky. He was known as Deanie. He was the son of Wilford Breeden, a plumber, a man people knew by name in Shelby County, and of Mildred Jewel Breeden, Millie, who opened her home when her son went missing and held the people who loved him close while they waited for news that never came the way that they'd hoped. Kyle was 39 years old when his life was taken. He was a man navigating a complicated world, addiction, money problems, a relationship that had its share of love and difficulty, and couldn't quite find solid ground. He was the kind of person who could be hard to reach and still deeply loved, who struggled and was still worth fighting for. What the public record gives us about Kyle's life is sparse. There's no long obituary, no detailed account of what he loved, what he hoped for, what he was like on a good day. What we have instead is the way that the people around him behaved when he was gone. The mother who noticed within 3 days, the family that went looking, the people who sat in a living room and prayed and waited. That's not nothing. That's actually a great deal. It tells you that Kyle Breeden mattered to people, that his presence was felt, that his absence left a hole. His murder went unsolved for years, during which his family waited for answers and received silence. The truth, when it finally came, did not arrive cleanly or without further cost. We'll tell that part of the story in the episodes ahead, but we want to say it plainly here before we go any further. Kyle Dean Breeden deserved justice. He deserved the truth. He deserved to have the people responsible for his death held accountable. Not some convenient substitute, but the actual person who took his life. He deserved better than a cold case on a shelf. And he deserved to be remembered as a man, not just a murder. We haven't forgotten him.
This is my